proud to chair the keynote address by Eric Brynjolfsson, who is a professor and senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and the director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab at Stanford University. It's a great pleasure to have you, Eric, with us today. I think you need really no introduction. You've written a lot of very, very interesting and exciting books about this topic and related topics. And today you're going to talk to us about the Turing trap. So we look forward to your keynote, and then, of course, we want to hear questions and answers. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be able to join you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm glad the technology allows us to connect. And I'm especially looking forward to the questions and comments that you all have. So I'll try to leave significant time for that. Please think about things you'd like to ask and discuss as I give the presentation. As you mentioned, the focus of my talk today is going to be about what I call the Turing trap. That is an homage to Alan Turing's famous Turing test, where he proposed that the ultimate test of whether a machine could be intelligence is whether or not a machine could imitate a human so well that no one could tell the difference between whether the entity was human or a machine. It was originally called the imitation game, in fact. And that's been a guiding light for a lot of AI researchers for over 50 years now. And while it's inspired a lot of people to go into the field, I'm going to argue that it's fundamentally flawed, particularly from the perspective of economists, like most of us on this conference. And I'll describe what the issues are, what the problems are, and propose a different approach to doing development of these incredibly powerful technologies. So let me just share my slides here. I think this will work. Hang on here. So I hope you can see my slides now, my first page.
No, not yet, but...
No? You don't see it?
So I look at the colleagues in the test. We tested it before, so this is the thing. We tested it half an hour ago.
It says it's sharing.
But now it doesn't.
You don't see my title slide.
Now we see it. Perfect.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
All right. Great. So as I mentioned, the idea here is what we call the Turing trap, aimed after the Turing test. And there's a paper about this that was recently published in the journal Daedalus that goes into more description. It's the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that there's a special issue focused on artificial intelligence. And the journal was named after the mythical figure Daedalus, who, as some of you may recall, was an inventor. And he's perhaps most famous for creating some wings that his son used to fly a little too close to the sun. But Daedalus was also, according to mythology, a great inventor who had designed the first robots. He made humanoid robots that were, according to legend, indistinguishable from humans. They could walk and talk and do work just like people could. Of course, that was just a story. Today, we are, for the first time in history, actually building such kinds of machines. But I'd like to have you join me for a little thought experiment. Let's suppose that 3,500 years ago, when Daedalus lived, he had actually succeeded in building those robots. He took his team of engineers and did what they wrote about and built human-like machines. And wonder of wonders, they automated all the tasks that the ancient Greeks were doing. Let's imagine a little bit what that would have meant for society back then and how things would have progressed. We could see that important tasks like making clay pottery would be completely automated. Weaving tunics, automated. Machines, the robots would do that. They had these horse-drawn carts that needed to be repaired. That would be automated. Sometimes people would get sick and they would automatically burn the incense to try to make them better. So we could go through all of the tasks that the ancient Greeks were doing and suppose the machines were doing all of those tasks, but only those tasks. Think a little bit about what that would mean for living standards. The good news is that there would no longer be any need for people to work. All the tasks would be done, so they could live lives of leisure. But you can also, by looking through all the tasks that were now automated, it's not hard to see that their living standards really wouldn't be increased all that much. Today, we have Zoom and computers and iPhones. I don't know if you can see me like here, and penicillin and vaccines for COVID, jet planes. We have all sorts of things that those robots wouldn't be making because they're only doing the things that the ancient Greeks were already doing. And I think it's not hard for you to see that simply automating what people are already doing helps a little bit, but it's not the main way that our living standards have improved. It's not the main way that science has progressed. And this is a key point about how the Turing test and the goal of simply imitating the tasks that we're already doing, as a number of researchers have proposed, is too narrow and in a way not ambitious enough a goal for us. But it is the essence of what Alan Turing, said that we should be focusing on. Is when he proposed the Turing test, he asked this important philosophical question: can machines think? In a way, he came up with a brilliant idea that he wrote about in his 1950 paper that is widely cited and widely used, that we should do the imitation game. And other researchers like Nielsen have taken this and said we should make a list of the tasks that humans are currently doing, all the tasks, all the work that's currently being done, and the focus should be on automating the existing tasks, and that would solve the problem. But I hope, as my example from Daedalus shows you, that is really only a small fraction of what drives living standards. So before I go into the details of the argument, I want to lay out the 10 principles or the 10 theses of the Turing trap. And I'll just go through each of those briefly, and then we'll go into a little more detail. The first point, I just want to be very fair. If you do make human-like intelligence, it is actually enormously beneficial. So I'm simply imitating is not all bad. There are some benefits to it. If we make human-like intelligence, as I mentioned, we'll have a lot more leisure. We also could have a lot more, increased living standards on many different kinds of dimensions. And perhaps most profoundly, we could understand, I think, the human brain better by making machines that are human-like. So there are some strong benefits to it, and I want to acknowledge that. But I also want to underscore that artificial intelligence, in principle, is much broader than human-like. Some people sometimes use the term AGI. That stands for artificial general intelligence. And I think people mistakenly use it as a synonym for human-like intelligence or for human-level intelligence, and that's not accurate. AGI is much broader than human-like. Humans are not very good at multiplying large numbers. They can't understand protein folding the way machines can do. There are myriad tasks that machines can do that humans cannot do. And so if you look at the set of tasks that are human-like, it's a small subset of the general set of artificial intelligence. And so I think it's a big mistake for a lot of researchers and a lot of people in the field to use the words human-like and artificial general intelligence as interchangeably, as synonyms. They are not. Most types of AI are not human-like. However, if you do make a machine that is human-like, it becomes a better and better substitute for human labor. If you make a machine that's a perfect imitation of a human for a particular task, then that machine, by definition, is a perfect substitute for the human for that particular task. And that's a goal, in some cases, something that technologists have succeeded in doing. However, as economists, we know that if you make a technology that's a substitute, or let's call it automation, that will tend to drive down wages. If you have two ways of solving a problem, and one of them is a machine and that has able to do the task more cheaply, that will substitute or compete with the human who's doing the work, and that will drive down wages. Thesis number 5, if you substitute for human labor, that will reduce the economic power of the people who were previously doing that task. And it will also reduce the political power of those people who are doing the tasks. The more you substitute, the less power the people who were previously doing those tasks will have economically and politically. And that creates the trap. And this is the essence of the Turing trap. you could be caught in a bad equilibrium where the people who have had their work replaced no longer have the political or economic power to argue for something different. They're dispensable. Yuval Harari called them the, quote, useless class. And if you have people who have lost their economic and political power in just about any political system, they don't have a way of forcing others to share more broadly with them. Now, people may choose to share some of the benefits of the economy with them voluntarily, and in many societies that happens, but it's not something that the people with no power can insist on. And this can lead to a trap where you get worse and worse outcomes for those people. Now, that's not the only path, and this is what's important. It's also possible for AI to complement human labor. Let's call it augment human labor. And in fact, many kinds of AI do exactly that. I'm working with companies like Cresta.ai that are specifically designing AI systems to not mimic humans, but to enhance their capabilities and keep a human in the loop. So human and machine work together to do new things that neither of them could have done before. In the case of Cresta.ai, it's basically answering questions for customers. And they find that having the system help the humans answer the questions creates more value than having the humans answer them on their own or having the system answer them on their own. The human plus machine is significantly better, and there are many examples of this. Now, if you do build a system that augments humans or complements humans, I'm using augmenting and complementing interchangeably here, that will tend to increase wages because it makes the human labor more valuable. And this is something that I find is commonly misunderstood. Many of my colleagues in the policymaking field and many managers and entrepreneurs, they have the mistaken belief that the main progress in technology has been by substituting for human labors. That's not true. In fact, most progress has been by augmenting human labor, by enhancing capabilities. There's some of each. One way we can see that augmentation has been more important is just imagine or think about what the wages for most workers used to be 100 or 200 or 500 years ago. A laborer was much less valuable back then, and wages for laborers were much lower. On average, wages are about 80 times higher now than they were 200 years ago. And that's because a worker working with a shovel, or better yet, with a bulldozer or a machine, can do much more work than a worker working by themselves with their bare hands. A worker working with a computer can create much more value than a worker by themselves. So in most cases, the technology has allowed humans to create more value and increase the value of 1 hour of human labor. It's not always true, and I'll talk later in the talk about how in some cases the value of human labor has gone down. But if you were to generalize, for most of the past couple hundred years, it's been a rising tide. Now, to go further, it's not just that augmentation creates new capabilities, but it also is the essence of creating new goods and services. And most of our economic progress comes from new goods and services. As my example with Daedalus showed a little while ago, it's not making clay pottery cheaper. The fact, if we could have free clay pottery and I had piles of clay pots around me, it wouldn't lift my living standards very much. It's the new goods and services where I get most of the value, and that requires new capabilities. And having technology focused on that frontier, that margin, is much more valuable than simply lowering the costs of the goods and services we already have. That's clear if you look back into the past, but I would argue that it's also true going forward into the future. And finally, for you economists in the audience, this is the key point, is that while both automation and augmentation can create some level of value, I would argue augmentation creates more value. The unfortunate thing is that today there are significantly excess incentives for the types of technology that automate work and insufficient incentives for augmentation. We do not have a Pareto optimal outcome. We do not have a market system that automatically gets us to the right outcome. And in particular, there are three groups that have excess incentives for automation. The three key groups are: number one, technologists; number two, managers and entrepreneurs; and number three, policymakers. And in the talk, I'll explain how each of them have the wrong sets of incentives And we have collectively as a society put our thumb on the scale to push too much for automation and not enough for augmentation, too much for substitutes and not enough for complements. So let me talk a little bit about now some of the technological landscape that we are in. I spend a lot of time at MIT and Stanford with my smart friends in computer science and artificial intelligence, and engineers in all kinds of areas. And we're looking at where the technology is. When I talk to some of the guys in the energy area, we have a joke that fusion is the technology of the future, and it always will be. So the people said in the 1950s that fusion energy was 20 years away. And then in the 1970s, they said it was 20 years away. In the year 2000, they said it was 20 years away. And today, there have been some breakthroughs, and they say that it's about 18 or 19 years away. So maybe we're making a little progress towards fusion, but it always seems to be off in the distance. I use that as a foil because it's not true for artificial intelligence. With AI, in the past, there wasn't much progress, but one of the reasons that I'm in it now is ever since about the year 2010, there's been ferociously fast progress in artificial intelligence as we started using deep learning techniques and broader machine learning techniques. And even just in the past couple of years, or even the past few months, there's been remarkable progress, particularly in the introduction of what we call foundation models, or these large language models like GPT-3 and PaLM. And since those systems were introduced just the past year, we've had the best estimates for progress in AI have not gone further into the future, but they've come closer. So for instance, there's a website called Materialize that has predictions about when different activities are going to be achieved. And winning the International Math Olympiad, the prediction back less than 1 year ago was that that would be achieved by a machine in the year 2041. Now the prediction is 2033, so it's getting closer. Or there's another prediction on the website about weekly general AI. So this is AI that can solve about half a dozen important goals, like it can pass the SAT exam that Americans take to get into college. And it can do at least 75th percentile on that, and it can solve a bunch of physical tasks. There's a long list of things that it has to be able to do. Again, the goal, the best expectation for that was 2042, 60 days ago, and now it's 2029. The reason those are coming much closer is that there have been some breakthroughs in these foundation models or large language models. And so we're getting much closer to the time when artificial intelligence is really going to transform the economy. It's one of the reasons I'm doing so much research in this. It's quite fundamental. And so we're moving from a world where Daedalus writes about these things, or the Greeks, or here's an image from Pavel Čapek's famous play called Rossum's Robots, which is the first use of the word robots. And that was just a story. People were telling these stories for thousands of years. But now some of you have probably seen the fun videos from Boston Dynamics. And I've visited them and see some of the robots that they're building. And you know that they're in some ways very humanoid. They can walk and lift boxes. They can do forward flips and back flips and jump and do a lot of things that humans can do. And DALL-E, this is some images generated by a system called DALL-E, where you can simply describe a setting, like show me teddy bears doing research on the moon, and a second later it will draw a drawing of that. It could be a cartoon like this, or it could be a photorealistic drawing. And this is a big part of why a lot of researchers think that AI is getting much closer now. We have both robots and cognitive systems that are incredibly powerful and in some ways increasingly human-like or more than human-like. You can measure this more concretely with big data sets. Here's some data from the ImageNet Visual Recognition Challenge. My colleague at Stanford, Fei Li, has put together a data set of about 18 million images, like antelope and starfish and glasses. And the system's not quite perfect, but you can compare it to humans. And the blue line there purple line that's rapidly increasing is the success of machine vision systems in about 2012, 10 years ago, there was a big improvement when deep learning systems were introduced by Jeff Hinton and his team. And ever since then, people have been using these deep learning systems and getting better and better to the point where they can recognize images now better than humans can on this image. I'm not saying they're better than humans in all tasks or even all image tasks, but on this particular data set of tens of millions of images, machines can outperform humans. Like, I'm not totally sure whether that's an antelope or a gazelle or some other animal, but the machine is able to identify that. And you can use your own system. If you have a smartphone, you can point it at a plant and Google will identify the plant. Actually, just yesterday, it was pretty funny. I had a snake in my backyard. I wasn't sure if it was a rattlesnake, and I took a picture of it, and Google quickly told me not to worry, that it was a Pacific gopher snake that looks like a rattlesnake, but it's not. So these machines are pretty good at recognizing images now, something they couldn't do recently. And think about it. If you are able to have a machine that can do something better than a human for a particular task, and you are an entrepreneur or manager, you're going to assign the machine to do that task instead of the human. So you're going to have it's like a phase change going from liquid water to steam that transforms the things that are done. This can boost productivity quite a bit, but I love studying productivity. It's been something I'm researching since a grad student, but as Paul Krugman once said, productivity isn't everything. And that's true even if you have infinite productivity. You'd think that would be pretty good. It's hard to do better than that, but it actually is quite limiting in some ways. Productivity, as you know, is output divided by input, or typically operationalized as GDP over labor hours. That's labor productivity. So imagine if labor hours go to zero, like in the Daedalus example. Well, what would happen to productivity? Productivity would be infinite. So in my ancient Greek example, where the clay pots were all made by machines, they had infinite productivity, but they didn't have infinite living standards because it was only the numerator stayed the same. The denominator went to zero. So infinite productivity is nice, but it's not everything. In fact, it's worse than that. What happens if labor hours go to zero? What would happen to labor income? How much would the laborers be paid? Well, if they have zero contribution, and they're paid their marginal product, it's hard to see how they make any money at all. So infinite productivity with zero labor input isn't necessarily the nirvana that you might imagine it would be. And this is not just hypothetical. Let's look at what's happened to the data. Here's David Otter and Doron Acemoglu's latest data. You've probably seen this work on what's happening to wages for different groups. At the top, the blue line is people like us who have graduate degrees. We've done relatively well in the United States and in other countries. The lower lines are people with less education, on the left for men and the right for women. But you can see that inequality has grown quite a bit, and wages have stagnated or even fallen for people with only a high school education. So those people have seen their labor demand fall, and with it, wages have fallen as well. And it's not just the economic prospects. As Ann Case and Angus Deaton pointed out, deaths from despair have been soaring. The red line that's going upward there, in this chart going up is bad. That's the deaths from despair. People with no college degree in the United States, white working class people, have had an enormous, more than doubling of deaths from alcohol, suicide, and drug abuse. So there's a real problem that goes beyond just the economic side. So let me give you my 3 principles of knowledge, wealth, and power that drive to the Turing trap. The first is drawn from Friedrich Hayek. Most useful knowledge is inherently decentralized across millions of human brains. Each of us has some knowledge of some local circumstances, the particular situation, and this is valuable for a shopkeeper to know what kind of toothpaste people in his neighborhood like, or whether there's inventory of a particular product is available, and all those kinds of detailed kinds of information is decentralized. Many of us have other kinds of knowledge that turns out to be useful, and that's an economic system uses that. And in order to take advantage of it, you have to compensate the people who have that knowledge. So that means that the power is decentralized as well. However, when knowledge becomes codified and digitized, it becomes for the first time alienable and potentially centralized. So if you take, say, the knowledge of that toothpaste and what kinds, whether people in my neighborhood like peppermint toothpaste or not, today, I think it's more likely that Walmart knows more about those tastes than the local shopkeeper. They have a database, they use the Internet of Things, and in Bentonville, Arkansas, they capture all this knowledge and they codify it. And now they have great detailed information about the demand for different products in every zip code in the United States, better than the local shopkeeper probably does. So that knowledge has become first codified and digitized and now centralized. And thirdly, when you centralize economic power and economic knowledge, it also centralizes political power. The people who have that economic knowledge are able to exert power that previously they weren't able to exert. When you put those three things together, principle one, principle two, and principle three, you get the Turing trap. You get a centralization of economic power and a centralization of political power as these powerful systems are able to do things that previously were done by the humans at the periphery. So how about the market? Can we count on the market to solve this problem? Well, unfortunately, the answer is no. You will get a Pareto optimal allocation if two conditions are true. One, that there's a consistent production possibilities frontier, if it can't change. Secondly, if there are no externalities. Well, as soon as I state those two conditions, you can immediately see that they're both false in the case of artificial intelligence. We have a rapidly changing production possibilities frontier. It's rife with externalities. AI is a general purpose technology that has many complementary uses. And that means we cannot expect that the market will give you the right balance of using the system for augmentation versus substitution. And to be very specific, as I mentioned earlier, there are three groups that have the wrong incentives: technologists, business executives, and policymakers. So let's first talk about the technologists. They are very inspired by the Turing test. If you talk to them, either explicitly or implicitly, they have as their goal to imitate human capabilities, whether it's imitating a human hand or a human brain, playing chess or solving other problems. A very standard task for graduate students in top universities is to take a task that a human is currently doing, playing some game or solving some task, some piece of work, and assign it to a grad student and say, hey, see if you can make a robot or an AI system that can do that. It's easy to assign that because you have an existence proof that it is in principle feasible. After all, a human can do it. And it's a concrete way for someone to work on it. But it doesn't really take full advantage of the technology. It's simply mimicking what a machine is already doing. And I would argue that if you look at this Venn diagram here, the set of tasks that humans can do is the big white area here. And the subset that machines could automate is a subset of that. And that's where most of the research is focused, in this black area here. But there's all this other area out here. These are new tasks that are currently not being done. It's almost an infinite set of those tasks, and they could in principle be done with the help of machines. I would argue we should focus our effort on this broader area and not this small black area here. It's also in some ways too ambitious. I would say there's a paradox that in some ways, it's harder to achieve human-like performance on the tasks that people are already doing than to achieve superhuman tasks, superhuman performance on new tasks. If you want to pick blueberries or climb up the stairs or button your shirt, those are things that all of us do routinely, and our brains and bodies have evolved to be able to do those over millions of years. Getting a machine to do any one of those three tasks is actually extremely difficult. On the other hand, getting a machine to multiply large numbers or to see X-rays or to travel at supersonic speeds, those are superhuman tasks that we've already achieved, and we can extend them much more easily. So simply trying to mimic humans is actually, in some ways, much harder than extending the superhuman frontier on other tasks. Business executives also have the wrong incentives. They have a lack of imagination and are focused too narrowly on a subset of tasks. So what we see is that automating labor can generate profit in two different ways. First off, it can make the economic pie bigger. So if you automate things, that's great. We create more value. But secondly, it shifts rents from the owner of labor to the owner of capital. And by shifting the rents, you get benefits to the owner, but it comes at the expense of someone else. So that leads to excess incentives. Owners have excess incentives for automation because that zero-sum part is not beneficial to society, but it is privately beneficial. So private and social incentives are misaligned. It's worse than that, actually. Not only are the incentives misaligned, but in most cases, if you are rent-seeking, you will destroy social value. If you can capture $1 million of value from your workers at the expense of $700,000, that could actually destroy most of the value. And the net gain is only $300,000 to you, but the net gain to society is negative $700,000. So there's a real destruction there. Instead of simply imitating what humans are doing, if we create new products and processes, you can create a lot more value. Let me ask you to do one more thought experiment. What if Jeff Bezos had automated existing bookstores and he had looked at the bookstores and said, let's replace all the cashiers. Now, Amazon is a $2 trillion company, but if he had taken this task of just taking the existing bookstore and replacing each of the humans, the cashiers, with a robot, I don't think it would be a $2 trillion company. That's not a very valuable way of using the technology. That would be a kind of a boring way to use the technology. Instead, he reinvented a whole new set of way of doing the work. And I would argue that too many managers are focused on simply automating the existing work and not focused enough on trying to reinvent the entire system the way Bezos did. It's harder to do the reinvention, but it's far more valuable. And finally, I'll just wrap up by saying policymakers also overemphasize automation. The tax system in the United States and almost every other country is explicitly designed to favor capital over labor. It encourages investment in capital more than labor. For instance, imagine you have two entrepreneurs, Alice and Bob, that each have the brilliant idea that will generate $1 billion worth of value and profit. Our tax system, and Alice's idea employs 1,000 workers, and Bob's idea employs no workers, but 1,000 machines. Which one is going to pay more taxes to the government? Well, as you know, in the United States and other countries, capital tax rates are half or less of labor tax rates. And the first rule of taxation is you get less of whatever you tax. So our government is saying we don't want as many Alices to make the companies that create value by using workers. We want more companies that replace workers. It's not clear to me what the social desirability is of putting our thumb on the scale to hurt workers and help capital owners is by that. And let me finish by saying that while there are different possibilities in the past that we've seen in the past, there's been a lot of automation. Going forward, there could be a lot more augmentation, and that the future is not preordained. We can go in either direction. Both automation and augmentation do create value, and perhaps we should just let the market decide. But in reality, the market is not getting these answers right. We have excess incentives for automation, insufficient incentives for complementing or augmentation. And we need to reset that and create more of a balance where we're creating more of the complements than we do currently. All three of these groups have the wrong incentives. And so there's my call to arms is for us to work harder to rebalance that so that we don't get caught in the Turing trap. If we do that, I think the future can flourish. It's not enough to simply rely on ex post distribution where the machines create a lot of value and then we hope it gets redistributed. Instead, I'd like to make sure that humans are indispensable to production and that AI is being used to augment humans instead of replace them. And if we do that, I think we'll be able to create not only much higher living standards and higher prosperity, but also more widely shared prosperity where everyone can benefit. This is all described in more detail in my paper, The Turing Trap. You can go to my website and read more about it. And I think we've left just a couple of minutes here for questions and answers. Be happy to take your questions and discuss this further.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. This was very inspiring, very interesting. We were all listening very attentively. So great to have a clear thesis and a clear presentation. I open the floor for questions and remarks, and perhaps just to kick us off. I mean, perhaps just one question to push you a little bit. I mean, a lot of your results, of course, depend on whether you think this AI-driven change and AI-driven augmentation of productivity is mostly beneficial on the capital side or on the labor side, right? And I guess my first question is: do we know a little bit more about how much of the AI that is out there is used to automate and how much is used to actually augment human capacities? I mean, I can think of a lot of sort of technologies that I use in my everyday life, including my smartphone. A smartphone is full of AI, and it doesn't replace me, right? I mean, it just augments my own capacities, right? And should, in principle, augment my labor productivity. And so I mean, just to push that argument a bit further, I mean, there's some research by Rob Lawrence at Harvard who sort of talks about the fact that a lot of these technologies are actually not capital augmenting, but rather labor augmenting. And in a neoclassical model, that would then lead to a decline in the labor share in income because basically we are not having enough capital. So he's sort of on the other side. Is a very neoclassical argument. Is on the other side of your.
Well,
so what's your take on that?
So my take is that that both things are happening, and I want to be clear. There are many benefits to automating work. The reason I think that there's evidence that there's excess incentives. I showed you the chart. Wages for many types of workers are falling. For most of the past 200 years, they were increasing. That's changed the past 2 decades or so. So at least for those types of workers, the system is not increasing their value, and it's not leading to more widely shared prosperity. Inequality has grown. We have unquestionably had concentration of economic and political power on many, many dimensions. There's a mountain of evidence of all of that. There are many reasons for that increased concentration. It's not just a matter of technology. There's globalization, there's tax policy. But I think most labor economists would agree that technology is the single biggest factor. But more concerningly, going forward, I wrote a paper called Suitability for Machine Learning Rubric that with Tom Mitchell, an AI researcher. And we found that the technologies that have been developed now, particularly in machine learning, are quite frequently used to substitute and replace humans. So we do have a challenge that this substitution and driving down of wages could get more severe going forward. I'm also advising a number of companies like Crusta, I think I mentioned, and others that are specifically have as their philosophy, let's develop AI systems that complement or augment humans. And they've had great success. Crusta went from zero to worth several $1 billion because this approach of complementing humans was really valuable to their customers. So I want to emphasize that both are possible, but from both a private and a social incentive, we have overemphasized the substitution, and it doesn't need to be that way.
So let's just collect perhaps 3 questions from the audience. I see Laura Nuske, Fabian Stefani, and Tom.
Hi, Erik. My name is Laura Nurski. I'm a fellow at Bruegel. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I really loved it, especially how you showed the excessive incentives across these three groups, the policymakers, the business executives, and the technologists. Now, on the first group, the technologists, you called them lazy and unimaginative in developing these new technologies. I think
I'm a professor, so I'm allowed to say that because I'm talking about professors.
I think another misaligned incentive for this group is that actually a lot of the R&D on the development of AI does not take place at universities, but in fact it takes place in big tech companies. So I wonder if you think we should organize as a society R&D of AI in a different way so that public sector can play a bigger role in designing these technologies.
Well,
for sure.
If you don't mind, can we collect, because we are close to the... So Fabian, please.
Thanks, Guntram. Thanks, Erik. Fabian Stefani is my name. I'm a fellow here at Bruegel and also at the Oxford Internet Institute. I was wondering, so I really like your argument about how this dynamic between augmentation, automation, facilitates or manifests, political agency. So you're saying that those that profit from one or the other dynamic, they gain political momentum, they gain political powers, and the other lose political powers. But I don't really buy this story, because what I see actually, there's a huge group, or there's a more and more wealthy group that makes a lot of money from augmented AI, that works with artificial intelligence, machine learning engineers, data scientists all around the world in urban centers. Shouldn't they actually then be, according to your logic, gaining political powers and advocating in their own self-interest for more augmenting artificial intelligence?
And there's a third one, Tom, please.
Thank you. I also really enjoyed the presentation, but I can't help but play a bit of the devil's advocate in the example of ancient Greece. So you assume that the whole population is not working because everything has been automated by machines and there is no raising of living standards. However, I'm wondering if there is a paradox there, because on the one hand, what if we assume that the whole population now has the time to be innovative and living standards can be actually raised more quickly? Or if you want to keep the assumption that all labor has been perfectly substituted by machines, then the machines would also be perfect substitutes for entrepreneurs, innovators, and scientific researchers, and would thus also create innovations and raise living standards. And so I'm reminded of the previous panel where Arturo mentioned that when we see that universal basic income was introduced, people became more entrepreneurial.
Right. So let me take the last one first, because so I think you're absolutely right. If the people are doing new things and inventing new capabilities, then living standards would rise. I wanted to hold a sort of an extreme case, supposing all we did was automate the existing tasks. Niels Nielsen wrote a somewhat famous paper saying that's what we should do. We should focus on the existing tasks and automate each of them. So I'm just taking him at his word that that's what the goal is. And to the extent that we all focus our efforts on that, we are not doing what you recommended, which is free up time to work on new things. My vision, and I think your vision, is that we should spend time on inventing those new things. And I was setting up two extreme cases, one where we only focused on automating existing tasks, another where we focused on new tasks. And both of us agree that focusing more on new tasks is beneficial. There's never, in the real world, there's never a completely clean division of that. It's more a matter of where we are focusing our efforts and our energy. There are a number of people who believe that simply automating the existing tasks is all we need to do. And I think you and I agree that that would be too narrow a vision. So I want to make sure people recognize that, sure, if you can automate the existing tasks, but if you do that, let's take that freed up time to do something new and not say, okay, job done. That's the end of what we have to do. Now, on the other task, the first question was about R&D, and it's a classic example in Economics 101 where the market doesn't have the right incentives. There are externalities, there are spillovers from R&D. And so almost any serious economist would argue that we need a role for government. And if we simply leave it to the private sector, whether the engineers in companies they have an incentive to create the maximum private profit. And that's great, but it as I showed in my paper, that will lead to excess incentives for automation. They'll capture the value for the owners of the capital and transfer benefits from other parties. They capture value in two ways. One, they create value, make the pie bigger. Secondly, they shift value from laborers, and that's a zero sum. That's not beneficial. So it would be beneficial for the government to be involved. There's many ways to do that. They can directly fund R&D. They can do it in government laboratories, or they can change the tax incentives. So instead of favoring capital, we would at least have an even playing field. Or perhaps if we think that we'd like to have more widely shared prosperity, we would flip it around and have things like wage subsidies and the earned income tax credit and other things that incentivize innovation in the direction of helping workers as opposed to capital. And so there's a whole set of policy tools. You guys have written about many of them. My colleague, Yorgos Petropoulos, has written some great stuff on this. And finally, the last question, let me see, can you remind me what that was? It was about, can someone remind me what that was?
Well, it was about sort of how political power is shaped and whether, yeah.
Exactly. And so I don't mean this to be completely black and white. I think there are opportunities for people to gain political power by augmenting, and in particular, when those technologies are introduced, that will lead to those people getting more political power. Perhaps more importantly, I talked to a lot of engineers, and they just weren't even aware of this problem. And many of them, aside from their own financial self-interest, they care about society, like I think many of you and like I do. And when I explain this challenge to them, they want to work on systems that create more widely shared prosperity, that complement humans, that benefit things, even if it's not narrowly beneficial to their company or to themselves personally. And so just to be very clear, my argument isn't that augmentation is all bad and augmentation is all good. It's that we have imbalance right now. And part of it is just due to a very powerful vision that Alan Turing put forward, that we should imitate humans, which I think is wrong. Another part of it is due to financial incentives that are built into the market system. A third part is, on top of that, there are some incorrect incentives that the government and policymakers put in place that further tilt the thing. If we eliminate those three sets of biases for technologists, for managers and entrepreneurs, and by policymakers, I think we could get a more level playing field, and we're going to get more complementing and more augmentation. If we don't do that, I do think there's a realistic scenario where you get more and more concentration of wealth. Over the past 20 years, there's been a big concentration of political and economic power, whether you measure it by concentration of companies or by economic inequality, or by the power of political elites of economic elites to shape the political conversation. There's research in all those dimensions showing increased concentration. It can continue to go further and further. It's not self-correcting. It's not self-equilibrating. And I think all of us have a challenge in front of us to understand the economics, and that we have a real problem that if we continue to push excessively for substitution, we're going to continue to drive down wages for many kinds of workers, and the set of workers that are going to be affected is growing. Technology affects more of them, and there's going to be a smaller and smaller group that benefits economically, and this could lead to a very bad equilibrium. Through much of history, we didn't have democracy, we didn't have shared prosperity, so I don't think there's any automatic stabilizer unless we actively work. So I know we're about out of time here, so let me just close by saying, I think it's incumbent on all of us to understand that right now, we have more powerful tools than we've ever had in history. These technologies are immensely powerful, and the ones that are coming online in the next 5 and 10 years are even more powerful. By definition, that means we have more power to change the world. We have more powerful tools. And that means our values matter more. We need to be proactive. We need to think about, what is our goal? What do we want to achieve with these technologies? If we simply sit back and assume it's automatically going to equilibrate to the right outcome, that would be a big mistake. There's no correct automatic outcome here. We have to actively use the tools, and policymakers at Bruegel and the United States, around the world, have an opportunity to understand what these trade-offs are and put in place policies that rebalance things between substitution and complements, or I would argue even go further and push more towards complements than we currently have towards substitutes. And if we do that, I think the next 10 years are going to be the best 10 years we've ever had. They're going to be a decade of enormously higher living standards, but also more equal and more broadly shared prosperity, which is something that probably almost everyone in that room would agree should be a goal of ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I think this was really very inspiring. And I think we indeed all agree that we need to work on these issues to increase welfare and share welfare in society. It's very clear that concentration of power is a big issue. And the more technologies drive in that direction, the more it is an issue for our democracies. I mean, no question about it. So I think really thinking and enlarging sort of the scope of this work beyond sort of the technology and the labor market and think about the societal impact, I think is really fascinating area of further policy research here for us at Bruegel as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, and you get a big real applause here in the room from all of us. Thank you.
That's nice. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.